In the early 1850s, Australia would see one of the biggest gold rushes in history. With the potential to amass fortunes otherwise unobtainable by the average person, Australia would see an international influx of over 500,000 people in just a year. To give you an idea of just how large this influx was for its time, it's believed in the 1800s Australia only had a population of around 350,000 people. This mass influx of prospectors chasing wealth would predominantly come from the United States, Germany, Poland, and China, but they would bring something with them that still terrifies people to this day. That something was leprosy, a disease that affects the nerves, skin, eyes, and lining of the nose. With no effective cure at the time, those unfortunate enough to contract leprosy would suffer from the crippling of their hands and feet, as well as paralysis and blindness. In response, the Queensland government would pass the Leprosy Act of 1892, ordering those who contracted the disease to be sent to a designated leper colony for isolation and treatment. Peel Island, a small island off the coast of Moreton Bay, would become home to one such colony. Over its 52-year period, over 500 people would pass through its doors, 200 of which would die on the island. Disgusting but unsurprising for the time, the colony was divided into compounds separated by gender and race. The whites would live separately from all others of colour, which would predominantly be Aboriginals, Torres Strait Islanders, South Sea Islanders, and the Chinese. The white patients' compound would consist of individual bungalows with steel beds, chairs and dressers, whilst all non-white patients were forced to live in tents until their huts were built. These huts would be constructed with corrugated iron and contain only dirt floors, which would turn to mud as water seeped through the cracks in the roof during rainfall. Eventually the floors would be replaced with cement, but are still described as only suitable for livestock. But despite race or gender, there was something all patients shared on Peel Island. All were confined by fencing, and no one had any real indication of if and when they would be released. Recently, a set of old cassette tapes containing the recordings of former patient Phyllis Ebbage would be restored. These recordings retell the story of her confinement on the island and give us an insight into her life. In 1940, Phyllis, who at the time was mother to 2 daughters, aged 2 and 3, had been feeling ill for months. She described feeling weak and tired, and before long, started noticing brown marks appearing on her body. Soon, her father-in-law would advise her to travel to Townsville to see a doctor. Once there, the doctor would run some tests on her and come to the conclusion she had contracted leprosy. With this conclusion, he understood that his diagnosis would result in Phyllis being forcibly moved to Peel Island for quarantine. Instead of informing Phyllis of what was to come, he instead told her father-in-law Albert and her husband Les. Once they arrived back home from their trip, Phyllis would find her entire family gathered at their home, all speaking in hushed tones around her. Picking up on the fact something was seriously wrong, and with no one telling her what was going on, Phyllis would go outside and sit on the front stairs of her home. Albert would join her on the stairs, and the two would cry together as Phyllis told him, "I think there's something seriously wrong with me." Despite knowing what was wrong with her, Albert told her nothing and instead informed her she would be travelling by plane from Townsville to Brisbane. The day she left, Phyllis didn't get a chance to say goodbye to her daughters, but was under the belief she would only be gone for a day or two. However, once in Brisbane, Albert would finally reveal to Phyllis that she had leprosy and would be now taken by boat to Peel Island. Phyllis begged for it not to be true, but unfortunately was soon on a boat headed toward the island. Upon arrival, Phyllis would be shown to the hut that was to become her new home. She would also be informed that while her family were permitted to visit, they could only visit once a fortnight for a maximum of 30 minutes. If that wasn't bad enough, children were not permitted on the island, which unknown to Phyllis at the time would mean she would be separated from her 2 daughters for 8 years. During her time on the island, she would undergo many different treatments and on one occasion almost die after being administered her 3rd dose of penicillin. After many years on the island, Phyllis was convinced she would never be allowed to leave and told her husband Les he could file for divorce. Les would decline her offer and continue to write to politicians and newspapers in his one-man campaign for her release. He would even go as far as to purchase a boat and use it to secretly meet up with Phyllis on the island. Unfortunately, island staff would eventually catch on to what the two were doing and call the police, resulting in a police chase on water that ended in Les being charged and fined £10. In total, Phyllis would spend 12 years on the island, constantly questioning staff as to why they wouldn't let her leave. One day, a staff member in charge would tell her that her husband needed to stop, referring to the campaigning he had been doing over the years she had been confined. Soon after he stopped complaining, Phyllis was released from the island and reunited with her family in 1951. However, one thing would be revealed to her upon release that was something she never got over. For all those years she'd spent imprisoned on Peel Island, convinced she had leprosy, Phyllis had actually been returning negative test results for the disease. The treatments that almost killed her and the separation from her family for over a decade was all for nothing. What's even worse is that when Peel Island was decommissioned in 1959, it would be discovered that the strain of leprosy present at the colony was never contagious to begin with. All the pain and suffering that occurred on Peel Island in an effort to stop the spread of leprosy was ultimately for nothing.